conversation in Russia complete. While Putin's grip on information in Russia was reaching new heights, his official political control was about to end. In Russia's constitution, presidents were limited to 2 terms, and so he wouldn't be able to run again in 2008. He had to pick a successor. The successor he ended up choosing was a very mild-mannered bureaucrat and confidant by the name of Dmitry Medvedev. He had been serving as the first deputy prime minister. He was in his early 40s, a committed Democrat who enjoyed American music and a pretty gentle and open guy. So at the party convention, Putin announces that Medvedev will take over as president in 2008. I mean, okay, technically he was just announcing that he would be the party nominee for president, but at this point everyone knows what that means. So Medvedev gets up and surprises everyone by saying that for continuity's sake, he is nominating Vladimir Putin as prime minister. There are some mixed feelings about this. On the one hand, Medvedev legitimately seemed like a new kind of leader, one that could usher in real progress in Russia in terms of ending corruption, allowing a free and open press, and extending friendly relations with the West. So it seemed like Putin might lose his grip, lose power. On the other hand, with Putin taking the second most powerful position in the country and watching Medvedev's every move, maybe nothing would really change. And people were anxious to see. Well, Medvedev is elected president in 2008, and Putin becomes prime minister. And early on, it seems like there's a glimmer of hope that Medvedev might be truly independent of Putin and be able to act on his own. But then those hopes were squashed in just a matter of months. The turning point occurred in summer of 2008 when the country of Georgia commenced an attack on the region of South Ossetia. Now, South Ossetia is a region of Georgia. So this is the Georgian military invading another region of Georgia, kind of like the Russians going into Chechnya. The big difference is South Ossetia is a province that is mostly ethnically Russian and had sought to distance itself from Georgia and to strengthen ties with Russia. So the Georgian government feels, hey, we're losing control of this region. They might be trying to actually leave and join Russia, so they send in the military. Well, when Georgia finally does attack, the Russian commander near the area calls Medvedev and says, what do you want me to do? After all, Medvedev is the president. And what does Medvedev do when he gets this call? He calls Putin. Putin was at the Beijing Olympics at the time and couldn't be reached. And Medvedev just keeps trying to reach him. And finally, after 4 hours, he can't get a hold of Putin, so he's got to make a decision. And so he says, yeah, go ahead. Send the troops into Georgia, into South Ossetia. Well, when Putin finally finds out about this, he's enraged by Medvedev's indecisiveness and lack of resolve. Putin was the first one to actually make a statement, which he made in China at the Olympics, stating that Russia would respond with force. He claimed that Russian citizens who were living in Georgia needed to be protected. And so they do. The Russian military responds with force. They send in more troops and invade and control South Ossetia. Obviously, Russia doesn't have a lot of trouble with the Georgian military, so they easily push out the Georgian troops and seize control. And to this day, South Ossetia is a semi-autonomous region that Georgia claims is still theirs, but Russia actually governs, as is another province where the same thing was happening called Abkhazia. After that, Putin publicly maintained the charade that Medvedev was the commander-in-chief, at least somewhat, but privately he ridiculed him, and he took full control of the country. At that point, Putin decided that handing over power was basically a failed experiment. So he orchestrated the writing of a change to the Constitution that would extend presidential terms to 6 years and allow him to serve for more terms in office. So in 2012, Putin returned to the presidency, and he's been serving in that capacity ever since. And in all likelihood, he's going to win re-election for a 4th term that will keep him serving until 2024. And so that's basically it. That's the end of the road in terms of Putin's political control in Russia. It's likely that he will never give up control until he's extremely old and frail, or possibly until he dies. Some protests have bubbled up from time to time, but nothing has with any seriousness challenged his rule, and it seems like nothing will, at least for the foreseeable future. Now, before we get to the analysis portion of all this, his tactics, habits, and strategies, let's take a look at 2 other things. His personal wealth and how he's been able to shape international events. I talked earlier about how Putin uses knowledge asymmetry. He's a spy at heart. He gets as much information as he can, and at the same time, he's as secretive as possible about his own life. I bring this up because when it comes to Putin's personal assets, no one really has any idea. Some say he's the richest man in Europe with over $40 billion. I've seen some say he's the richest man in the world with over $100 billion. In 2012, in official documentation, Putin claimed his own income at about $113,000. I've seen estimates of $2 billion and a few hundred million. The truth is, no one knows. And also the truth is, it doesn't matter. And why not? Well, let me give you an example. Putin has constructed a massive residence on the Black Sea. It's beautiful. It looks like a royal palace that could have been built 300 years ago, except presumably, with Wi-Fi and such. It's a massive complex. It's got a theater, a church, swimming pools, heliports, parks, apartments for his bodyguards and staff, and more. We can see it all with satellite photos, and the estimated cost to construct it was $1 billion. So Putin must have at least $1 billion if he built himself $1 billion home, right? Well, no. Technically, he didn't build it, and technically he doesn't own it. It's owned by an oligarch, a billionaire, who is very close to Putin and depends on him for his fortune. Some of the construction was funded with government funds, and yet by all accounts, it is Putin's private residence, one of 20 that he owns. But he doesn't need to technically own it on paper in order for it to be his. I think it's likely that Putin's official net worth, if you were able to see it, might be quite low. It's possibly less than $1 billion. But he doesn't need the money. He basically owns the Russian government. And he's surrounded by billionaire oligarchs who have to do his bidding or risk having their fortunes seized from them, and worse. Because of his power, Putin basically has as much money as he wants. Ironically, there's some truth to what Putin said when someone asked him if the reports about his wealth are true. He said, quote, "I am the wealthiest man not just in Europe, but in the whole world. I collect emotions. I am wealthy in that the people of Russia have twice entrusted me with the leadership of a great nation such as Russia. I believe that is my greatest wealth." To which you can only respond, yeah, sure, something like that. I should mention that in terms of building up this wealth among his friends, that he can now access whenever he wants, he went the slow and secret route. From what people have been able to turn up in official documentation, which is not much, it appears he has been siphoning money off for himself and his friends and associates since his days in St. Petersburg. But rather than starting with a splash and getting a lot of money early, it's been little by little, and it took a while for people to notice, but now there are billions of dollars at his access. Now, in terms of international relations, Putin has improved markedly over time. In 2004 and 2005, he attempted an intervention in Ukraine in order to install a president there who would be loyal to Russia, and it backfired terribly. Since then, Putin has done a number of things remarkably well and learned from that experience. The first is to take advantage of international dissatisfaction with the USA's hegemonic place in the international order. Early in his rule, Putin had a complex relationship with the United States. He would sometimes seek closer ties and more stable relations with the U.S., and in the wake of September 11th, 2001, he did his best to actually open a friendly hand to the U.S. That changed when President Bush failed to listen to his objections and built anti-missile bases in the Czech Republic and Poland, and also when he invaded Iraq. That animosity has only solidified over the years, as Putin has realized that many countries are dissatisfied with the USA, and intimidated and frightened by the fact that no one can really do anything to stop the U.S. So Putin set himself up as the USA's main opponent, and that has given him a lot of clout. It's made him really popular both at home and in many places abroad. Obviously not the U.S., but many other places that are dissatisfied with the U.S. now have a very favorable opinion of Vladimir Putin and of Russia, and that gives him better leverage to work with them. The high water mark for Putin's international influence came in Syria in 2011. Syria is an old ally of Russia's. In 2011, a civil war broke out in Syria. A coalition of rebels, some of them moderate and some of them extreme, including ISIS, was fighting against the Syrian government, and sometimes against each other. The U.S. was covertly supporting the rebels, and Putin decided to strongly support Assad, which was the government that was in charge in Syria. He not only funded and provided arms to the Syrian government, but he embedded troops with the Syrian troops. And this put the U.S. in a very difficult situation. If we want to help the rebels by bombing the Syrian government forces, well, we'd have to watch out, because what if we accidentally bomb Russian troops who are with them? Are we willing to start World War III over Syria? So this limited the U.S. involvement. And it was effective. The USA was trying to support these rebels, but they failed. Assad, the guy that Putin was supporting, is still in charge today. And it's looking like the tides of the civil war has turned, and he will continue to lead Syria. So when people call Vladimir Putin the most powerful man in the world, and more than a few have, this is in part what they are talking about. If he was able to defeat the US in a proxy war and keep his favored regime in charge there, then who could credibly claim to be more powerful than that? Well, that's where I'm going to end my narrative and go into analysis. As in every episode, there are a number of things I haven't covered, like Russia's seizure of Crimea, Edward Snowden taking refuge in Moscow, the Russian cyber attack on Estonia, the Sochi Olympics, his divorce from his wife, his embrace of religious orthodoxy, and more. But as you know by now, this isn't meant to be a complete summary of Putin's life, but rather an evaluation of what made him great. Last episode, I talked about a number of elements of his greatness, like focus and more general strategies and work habits. I won't go over those again. The main thing I want to touch upon this time is his communication strategy. Most people have the wrong model for how you persuade people. The traditional model is basically this. People look at the world and try to figure out what's true. When they think something is true because of the evidence, they believe it. I don't think this is Putin's model. His model basically goes like this. If people want to believe something and they're able to believe something, then they will believe it. And this definitely isn't exclusive to Vladimir Putin. You see many of the world's great persuaders using this type of model. With this method, you should spend less time convincing people of what is true and more time getting them to want to believe you. Using this strategy has allowed Putin to get away with a lot. Has he had journalists murdered? Probably, but most people in Russia don't care. Why? Because they don't want to believe it. They believe that Putin is on their side, that he stands for a resurgent and strong Russia. So he doesn't need to convince them that the evidence is there, that he didn't murder these people. He just needs to give them the ability to believe he didn't have those journalists murdered. Okay? People don't need to actually believe something is true. They need the ability to believe it and the desire to believe it. Putin has used this a number of times. For example, when he said he was arresting media moguls and seizing their television stations because of tax evasion and fraud, or how he has maintained that he is democratically elected despite clear evidence of election rigging since 2004, or his claims that all of these journalists who investigate him who have ended up dead, he had nothing to do with it and bears no responsibility. The next obvious question is, well then, why do the Russian people want to believe him? As I have said, you have to want to believe someone and be able to believe them. So why do they want to believe him? And the ability to get people to want to believe you is more of an art than a science, but there are a few keys to how Putin has done it. The first is to project power. We've already talked a little bit about this, but he seems powerful, and people have an innate desire to follow that, and so they do. The second is that he inspires pride. Putin has made people proud to be Russian again. I think of the way Steve Jobs inspired pride by creating a lifestyle brand. If you had a Mac, you were someone who thought different and appreciated aesthetic beauty. So you need to inspire pride. I'm sure my Android user listeners will be happy that I just compared Vladimir Putin to Steve Jobs. A third element of it is be a trusted advocate. People will want to believe you if they believe you have their best interests at heart and will do everything in your power to fight for those interests. Putin's pitch to the Russian people has never been, I will do the right thing, the moral thing. It's always been, I will do what is best for you. So 3 things to get people to want to believe you. Project power, inspire pride, and be a trusted advocate. After that, you just have to give them the ability to believe you and your story, and they will. Okay, well, that's basically it. I know this story doesn't have a great ending, and that's because Putin's still alive and he's still working, and there's more of this story to be told, and we'll see how it plays out. Just to close up, one last story. I want to tell a story about Vladimir Putin's father. Remember, his father grew up in St. Petersburg, relatively poor, and he lived that way basically his whole life. He was just an average Russian man with little ambition. When his son became president for the first time, he was already old and frail and on his deathbed. And as he lay close to death, he saw the news that his son had just become president. And with what were close to his last words, he said, "My son is like a czar. That does it for this week's episode. And by the way,